Testing, test, test. Welcome, everyone.
Go get him, John.
Welcome, everybody, to the Coastal Studies Institute.
Exit mantle.
I'm waiting for the live mic. Good evening. This is quite the crowd, Larry. You should be happy about this. Welcome to the Coastal Studies Institute. Welcome to our Science on the Sound. We appreciate all of you coming out this evening. Those in this room, those in the other room, and those in the third room we're preparing. And all of you that might be online. I just have a couple announcements, and then I'll introduce our speaker this evening. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Reed Corbett. I'm the Executive Director here at the Coastal Studies Institute. And again, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for one of our Science on the Sounds. I'll mention that we do have a Science on the Sound every month. So we post those in social media. Please take a look, pay attention. Our next one is February 20th with the feature presentation on North Carolina bats by Marissa Liverman of the Citizen Science and Conservation Specialist at the Outer Banks Center for Wildlife Education. So again, that's February 20th, same time, same place. I'd also like to make you aware that we have our annual open house coming up on February 29th. That is Leap Day. I don't know if that's actually a thing, but it is February 29th. 1 to 4 p.m. that Saturday, February 29th, our open house. All right, so now I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Larry Tise. Larry's going to talk to us tonight about, as you can see, and the book that maybe many of you have, on Circa 1903, North Carolina's Outer Banks at the Dawn of Flight. Larry is a native of North Carolina, from Winston-Salem, I believe, 2 degrees from Duke University and his PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Tise is the former director of the NC Division of Archives and History. And Dr. Tise was also the Wilbur and Orville Wright Distinguished Professor of History at East Carolina University from 2000 to 2015. I was going to tell you that books would be available, but those sold out. Downtown Books does have some of those books available if you'd like to, not after this because they'll be closed, but they are there if you'd like to pick one up. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Larry Tise. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed, and everybody at the Coastal Studies Institute. I should tell you from the very beginning that I taught a 2-hour class at East Carolina yesterday, and then I gave a lecture at the East Carolina School of Art, and by the time that was over, I had no voice. And my voice started returning at about noon today, so hopefully it will last during the presentation, but the voice that you're hearing right now is not the way I normally sound, but we'll do the best we can. It's really wonderful to see so many people come out to find out what the coast of North Carolina was like in 1903. And during the course of this presentation, you will come to see that I have some unconventional findings about the coast of North Carolina. First of all, the only time the word Outer Banks appears in this book is in the title, because the word Outer Banks had not been invented in 1903. The airplane was invented in 1903, but not Outer Banks. The Outer Banks was something that came along later and was a term created by people who wanted to get tourists to come to North Carolina. And at the same time they invented the term Outer Banks, they also reinvented the term lost colony. And they also decided, well, if the Wright brothers flew here their first powered flight in 1903, well, we've got two pieces of history that Williamsburg does not have and Florida does not have. So why don't we create a tourist mecca right here on the coast of North Carolina? And so when you drive up and down 158 on the coast, you'll see the fruition of that dream of creating a tourist mecca. But in 1903, the coast did not look anything like what it looks like today. So, see if we can make this work. This book is sort of an elongated meditation on the Carolina coast. I grew up in North Carolina. I was a landlubber from Winston-Salem, and our family came to Nag's Head from time to time. And it didn't look anything then like it does now. And I read my first book about the Wright brothers when I was a kid and went to the Wright brothers Memorial. Our family also went to Washington, D.C., and I saw the Wright brothers plane hanging in the old castle building there. Then that was in the 1950s. And as I read about the Wright brothers, I realized that the Smithsonian did not recognize the Wright brothers as having the first successful flight until 1942. And at that time, the Wright brothers' plane, which is now in the Air and Space Museum, was in the National Science Museum in London, England. So if you wanted to see the Wright brothers' plane anytime up until after the end of the Second World War, you would have had to go to the National Science Museum in London. And that was because the Smithsonian did not recognize the Wright brothers as having the first powered flight. You can ask me about that later, if you would like. All right, where do I have to point this? Okay. There must be a place I have to point this to make this work. I want this to back up.
Push the back button on there?
I'm pushing it. Okay, we'll see how it works. What generated the idea for this book was something that gnawed at me from the first time I read a book about the Wright brothers when they came to North Carolina. When Wilbur arrived in Elizabeth City in 1900 on the first trip, he said no one in Elizabeth City seemed to know anything about the place or how to get there. He was talking about Kitty Hawk. Nothing could have been further from the truth. There was nobody in Elizabeth City who didn't know where Kitty Hawk was. The problem was that Wilbur didn't know where he was because Wilbur and Orville had never seen an ocean before, They'd never been around water. They grew up in the middle of Ohio and Indiana, and they didn't know what to do about an ocean. And they also didn't know what to do about all the sand that they encountered here. I wanted to draw your attention to a map that was created in 1902, the year before the title of this book, and just wanted to point out a few things. If you came to this area in 1903, you would find a whole series of life-saving stations up and down the coast. You would find lighthouses up and down the coast. Has anybody ever seen those lighthouses? But you would also find a load of river lights. That's a river light. That's a river light. There's a river light right there. And down there. There were many, many more river lights than there were lighthouses. In addition to that, you would find a canal that came down into what is now Powell's Point, or across Powell's Point. This is the Albemarle-Chesapeake Canal, which was completed in around 1859, before the Civil War. And you would also find another canal, the Dismal Swamp Canal, which came down to Elizabeth City. And those canals were operating extremely well in 1903. You would also find train tracks, and train tracks that came down to Edenton. Those train tracks are still there today. And those tracks connected the coast of North Carolina to the rest of the world. You wouldn't find any inlets or outlets particularly, because by 1903, the people on the coast of North Carolina had given up on any thoughts of trying to get access to the ocean. And the fact they called these the barrier islands, not the Outer Banks, or they called them the sandbanks. And they viewed it as a limiting thing, not from getting from the ocean into the coast of North Carolina, but they viewed it as a wonderful natural barrier that created what I call throughout this book an inland sea. I mean, we call them sounds, but if you're in the business of trying to do transport, the sound area is actually a sea. And so in 1903, when the Wright brothers came to North Carolina, the Suez Canal had been finished, the Panama Canal was in the process of being built, and Canada was building a St. Lawrence Seaway. And so everybody was trying to learn, how can we use the waters that are inland to navigate and to move around? And so the reason why the term Outer Banks was created is because by 1903, people were looking out to the Outer Banks and not looking at the Outer Banks to come from the ocean to North Carolina. So it became an outer limit to North Carolina. So you have to turn your head around a little bit to think in a different way. So one of the arguments I make in this book is that the coast of North Carolina in 1903 had the most advanced and sophisticated infrastructure and transportation network of any other place in the world. It was not a lost area. It was not at the ends of the earth. In fact, it was totally connected to the rest of America. We'll come back to that idea as we move along. I couldn't have done this book without discovering a whole bunch of photographers whose images hadn't appeared before. And I also had to think about the media as the tool of this book. So instead of thinking about documents, you think about other types of materials: maps, photographs, postcards, cyanotypes, lantern slides, glass plate negatives. You may not have heard of some of those terms, but in 1903, postcards had just recently been invented, and people were putting images on postcards. The Wright brothers flew in Le Mans, France, and it's the first place they flew overseas. And I went to Le Mans to celebrate the 100th anniversary of their flights in Le Mans. And the first thing they told me is, "Did you know that postcards were created in Le Mans?" And the first great use of postcards was to do postcards of the Wright brothers flying in Le Mans. And if you look at postcards, which I love to look at sometimes, you will find that there are thousands of postcards from France in that period of time, 1908, which is when they first flew there. Cyanotypes is like a blueprint that you do for building construction. Lantern slides, I'll show a little bit more about that. Glass plate negatives. The Wright brothers, when they came to North Carolina, all of their photographs were made on glass plate negatives. They put emulsion on glass, they exposed the glass, they put it in a box, and they didn't know until they got back to Dayton in their photography lab whether they actually had a picture or not. So it's not like today when you can get instant pictures. So as a consequence, we have almost no pictures of the Wright brothers' flights in 1908, because after they took their first two pictures in 1908, which is when they did tremendous flights at Kill Devil Hills, they punctured the web for their camera, and so all of the glass plates were ruined. But anyway, those are the tools. And I don't know what I am doing wrong there. Okay. I introduce you to some photographers that you probably have never heard of, or you may not have heard of. This is the one I love the most, and sorry that this photograph of him is not that great, but Corydon Perney Cronk, which is one of the worst names ever. Somebody bought a book who was from Michigan. Yeah, he was from Michigan. And he didn't go to Kalamazoo College. He went to the University of Michigan. And but anyway, he was a meteorologist, and he came actually he didn't come to North Carolina. He went to Cape Henry weather station, which was the weather station for the southeastern area of the United States. And he was a great photographer. And in 1899, he took on the assignment of coming to the coast of North Carolina to take photographs of the damaging San Scirocco hurricane of 1899. I tell people, and I love to get challenged on anything I say, I'd love to be challenged on because I want to get it right. But the San Scirocco hurricane, which occurred in 1899, was the most damaging hurricane we've ever had in North Carolina. So somebody will correct me on that. But it changed the entire environment of the coast. And I'll show you some pictures of how it changed. But anyway, this man, Corydon Perney Cronk, came down here, and you'll notice that he expired in 1903. Just a few months before the Wright brothers had their first powered flight. but he was a great photographer, and he was interested in many, many things. You may have heard of this guy, Herbert Brimley, H.H. Brimley. He was the creator of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Science, which is up in Raleigh. But he was very interested in the coast of North Carolina. He took lots of pictures, and every time he was around somebody who took a picture, he said, "Could I have a copy of that?" And so he put together this fabulous collection of photographs, part of which are at the Museum of Natural Science and part of which are in the State Archives of North Carolina. This guy, Frederick Olds, he's one of my favorite characters of all. He was the founder of the North Carolina Museum of History in Raleigh, if you've been there. And he was a zany character. He was a journalist. He liked to dress up in Confederate uniforms, even though he didn't serve in the, he was a little bit too young at 7 to fight in the Civil War, but in any case, he was a zany character, and one of the chapters in this book is devoted to a trip that he made up the coast of North Carolina. And he visited many, many of the places that we know along the coast. Lauren Wright. How many Wright brothers were at Kill Devil Hills? Wilbur, Orville, and Lauren. Lauren was at Kill Devil Hills too. You may not have heard of Lauren, but Lauren took many of the photographs that we associate with the Wright brothers in the Wright brothers collection. And all you have to do is if you have a picture that has Wilbur and Orville in it, you say, well, somebody had to take that picture. And who took that picture? And you start checking around to see, well, Lauren made a lot of the photographs that we call Wright brothers photographs. He wasn't there all the time, but he visited them almost every year. In fact, you recognize this picture of the Kill Devil Hills Lifesaving Station? Look. Oh yeah, right. Okay. Well, Lauren Wright took this picture. So whenever people say, "Oh, was that a Wright brothers photograph?" you can say, "Yeah, that was Lauren who took that picture." One of my other favorite photographers, and I discovered his photographs too, is James Hare. James Hare was another zany character. All of these photographers were zany characters, and James Hare became absolutely famous because there was a war, I believe it was in 1902, in which Japan attacked Russia, and Japan beat the daylights out of Russia, and James Hare got the assignment of traveling with the Japanese army as it pummeled Russia. And so he made loads and loads, hundreds and hundreds of photographs of the Japanese army as it invaded Russia. And at about this time, 1903, is when newspapers started having photographs in them for the first time. And so a lot of Hare's photographs appeared in these newspapers. And so Hare got the assignment to come to North Carolina and get the first picture of the Wright brothers flying in the air. You know that picture that we always look at? The Wright brothers didn't reveal that picture until 1908. And before they revealed that picture, James Hare came to Kill Devil Hills and took a picture of the Wright brothers flying. And the Wright brothers immediately said, "We flew back in 1903. And so they revealed the picture of their 1903 flight for the same time. So Hare got the first picture. I found James Hare's photographs of the Wright brothers. They're in not glass plate negatives, but lantern slides. And this is what a lantern slide looks like, 3x5 basically. And you had to have a projector like this with a a candle in it to show those lantern slides. So fortunately, James Hare put together a lantern slide show of his trip to get a photograph of the Wright brothers. But as I suspected, when I found out that he was the photographer, he must have taken other pictures of the Outer Banks. See there, I slipped up and said Outer Banks. and so I was right. I found his pictures at the University of Texas. Another important part of this book is maps. There are maps throughout the book, and I try to use the maps to show how this area of North Carolina, coastal Carolina, operated. And one of the most interesting maps I found, and I haven't found another copy of it, but it was an official government map. It must be other copies, but I found this map in the Twitty and Company offices up in Corolla, and it was just hanging on the wall, and I looked at it and I said, wow, this is really an interesting map. And what interested me about this map is that it showed all the lighthouses, all the life-saving stations, and it showed, you know, the Body Island lighthouse and all the others, but it also did something else. And so this is an area that we know right down here, but this map had something on it that I just loved. It showed the extent of the light of each lighthouse, how far out it could be seen. And as you can see, the light patterns from the lighthouses overlap each other. So theoretically, and perhaps actually, there was no point along the coast that a light would not be seen from the ocean side. However, there's something else very interesting about that, is that those lights, they don't just point out, but they go all the way around. And so they serve as points of navigation, not only to the ocean, but also in the inland sea. And so if you've got river lights around the sounds, and you've got these lighthouses, the lighthouses light the inland as well as the ocean. And so what you end up with is a whole inland sea in an area that is illuminated, and you can see to navigate 24 hours a day. That's very important because the commerce in this period on the coast of North Carolina was intense, it was lively, and it went on 24 hours a day. I'm going to talk more about that. This is what a river light looks like. They were all over the place, and they looked weird. They were out, you know, out in the sounds, and just like the lighthouses, the river lights had lighthouse keepers, and usually families lived in these lighthouses, in these river lights. And it's interesting that when Fred Olds did his trip, he stopped at some of the river lights and would say, "You got anything interesting up there?" And one of the river lights he stopped at, and they said, "Yeah, we just got a load of bananas. How would you like a banana?" So they threw down a banana to Fred Olds, and just, "What's happening? What's the weather going to be like?" And the lighthouse keepers, you know, they would know if there's storms coming or whatever. It's a very interesting system. This is a Roanoke River light, which was at the mouth of the Roanoke River. I already mentioned the Albemarle and Chesapeake Canal, but they were up here and connected this whole area to Norfolk, Virginia. You know, the northeastern North Carolina was settled originally from Virginia, and Virginia, the Norfolk area, the Suffolk area, has always been the outlet for this area of North Carolina. This area of North Carolina has never been oriented toward Raleigh, except when they want money from the state. This area of North Carolina has always been oriented. I can't tell you how many people I have met around these areas. And I'll say, well, where were you born? They'll say, Manio. And I'll say, you grew up here? Yeah, all the way up until I went into the Navy. And yeah, I was up there in Norfolk in the Navy, and then I came back here and got married, or I worked in the shipyards up in Norfolk. But this area has always been oriented toward Norfolk, and never more so than in 1903. I mean, I started thinking about this when I started reading newspaper articles about the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk and Kill Devil Hills. And the North Carolina newspapers had almost nothing about the Wright brothers while they were here. And so all of a sudden it occurred to me, well, the newspaper of record here was the Virginian Pilot. And so then I started going through the Virginian Pilot, and that's where all the news about what the Wright brothers were doing went out. And so this area has always been oriented in this way. I call it a clockwork coast, and it was a clockwork coast. It was so good that in December of 1903, when the Wright brothers' shafts on their planes on the 1903 flyer broke, Orville could leave Kill Devil Hills. He could go back to Dayton. He could make steel shafts as opposed to aluminum, which is what they made their original shafts out of. And he could get back to Kill Devil Hills about 7 or 8 days later. And he could go and make them and come back. The Wright brothers could get on a train in Dayton at 6 o'clock one morning, and the next day they could be in Elizabeth City going over to Kill Devil Hills and Kitty Hawk. It was a tremendously good system. They could also write a letter back home to Dayton, and they could take it over to the Kill Devil Hills lifesaving station and put it in the mail, and the letter would not arrive the next morning in Dayton, but it would arrive without fail the next morning. I mean, the mail system was just unbelievable how well it's connected. There was a telegraph system as well. However, the telegraph system on the coast of North Carolina went from life-saving station to life-saving station. It was a self-contained telegraph system, but when the Wright brothers started coming back, the Weather Bureau also had a telegraph system. And in fact, after the Wright brothers did their first powered flight in 1903, they went to the weather station in Kill Devil Hills, not the Black Pelican, but the weather station that was across the street, which is no longer there. And they sent their telegraph back to Dayton saying, successful flight, we'll be home by Christmas. Call the press. In this book, those of you who have copies of it, and those of you who don't have copies but who will have copies, you'll find a map at the front of the book, which I created. And this map shows how the Wright brothers got basically from Norfolk to Kitty Hawk and Kill Devil Hills. They used different routes. For a while, they would go straight from Elizabeth City to Kitty Hawk and then down to Kill Devil Hills, but later they decided to go through Manteo, and they would take gas launches over to Kill Devil Hills. The first time they came, there were no gas launches, but by 1903, every hot rod on the coast of North Carolina had a gasoline launch. I mean, it was the first hot rodding that you could do, and everybody was so proud. Yeah, you can give you a ride in my gasoline launch. We can get you over there in no time flat. This is the key to the things that I include in the map. The environment, very important, which all of these photographers looked at in some way. This picture is very interesting. I did a previous book called Hidden Images in the Wright Brothers Photographs, and I wrote a caption saying, well, the Wright brothers didn't know what they were doing because they were trying to take a picture of their flying machine, which is right there, but they didn't aim the camera correctly. But what I didn't realize until I started working on this book is that they came to North Carolina the first time in August of 1900. And the previous August had been the San Sirocco hurricane, which just politely moved all of this sand almost down to the center of Kitty Hawk. So they were at Kitty Hawk, and this was all new sand, which was moved there by that storm, which then made me start looking for other photographs. This is another photograph of the sand encroachment into Kitty Hawk. I mean, almost buried Kitty Hawk in sand. That's one of the distinctive things about that hurricane, is it reconfigured the sand on the coast. Good old Corydon Perney Cronk. I have to stop to be able to say his name. Got this great picture of a shipwreck. I love this picture of this tree that was right at Nag's Head. You know where, I believe I'm right on this, I could be corrected. This tree was almost where Jeanette's Pier is today in Nag's Head. And I believe that because I have some other pictures in which it appears. Civil War. One of the most interesting things about this period of time, 1903, is when the Wright brothers came to North Carolina in 1900 originally, it was only 35 years after the end of the Civil War. I mean, there were still veterans all over the place who could remember the war, but you know, the Civil War is hardly discussed in any of the literature, in any of the letters or diaries of Wilbur and Orville Wright. And they wrote thousands and thousands of letters, but they never talked about the Civil War. And it was like, you have to understand that in this area, the Civil War was a very divisive event. Not divisive between the Union and the Confederacy so much as a divisiveness between neighbors. Because half of the people in this area of North Carolina fought for the Union, and the other half fought for the Confederacy. And so it was a war between neighbors. You know, you usually talk about the Maryland and Kentucky, you know, the border states, but Eastern North Carolina was a border state. It was, and when the Freedmen's Colony was created near Manteo, that's after the Union took over the area and slaves fled from plantations and came to Manteo. Well, that's another long story. But it's hardly remembered, but this one guy, and I do have his name, but I can't remember it right now, from Manteo, was celebrating his service. Somebody may know who this man is, in the Union Army. Burnside's headquarters, when people from the north came to the Carolina coast in 1903, they always wanted to go to Burnside's headquarters, which my understanding is it burned sometime. Some of you may know. And why is it a historic site? I mean, it's headquarters of the Union Army. commerce and trade, I've already talked about some of this. The commerce that made North Carolina rich at that period of time was fish. Fish was packed up and shipped off. It could be in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore the next morning, Philadelphia and New York the day after. Fresh fish from coast of North Carolina. Lumber, timber. This is a big time of timber and logging, and North Carolina became the source of timber for pulp, but also for furniture. And timber from North Carolina was shipped all over the country to build houses, to build, big brownstones in New York City, but this is where the lumber came from to build all of that. You could ship your potatoes and get them shipped by Norfolk, Newbern, and Washington direct line to connect to Norfolk and with Old Dominion steamships for New York City, and it can be, it's hard to believe that you could ship fresh food quicker then than you can by truck today. It's just amazing. At this period of time, in 1902 or 1903, they had already conceived of the intracoastal waterway, and there were members of Congress from North Carolina and Virginia who were saying, let's build that thing. And they proposed, this is the proposal to build it, and by 5 years later, they were already starting to build what we now know as the Intracoastal Waterway. And this plan, it didn't show going through Alligator River. It showed going on the west side of Roanoke Island. But as you know, it goes through Alligator River. Whenever you looked at any kind of business on the coast of North Carolina in this period of time, blacks and whites worked together, side by side. Even though this was a period of the flowering of white supremacy, blacks and whites worked together, even though they didn't go to school together. Of people and being people. This is a tranquil house, and this is just a classic photograph of a family or a couple of families going out and getting their picture taken at the tranquil house, and they're not looking at each other, they're not in rows, they're posing at strange different angles, but they got their guns with them, and it's just people being people. This is another Kronk photograph, which I just love. And this is people getting in their Sunday clothes, and this is at Chickamaucomico burying ground. And but all of the stones, or the tombstones, were made out of wood, basically. And Fred Olds talked about the beauty of these burial grounds, which are all up and down the sandbanks. And I just love how Kronk got these people to pose for this picture. They're not in a group, they're doing things. And my other favorite guy who got the picture of the Wright brothers' first flight, he was interested in blacks. And so he took this picture of a family in Manteo, dressed up, going to church. This is a family going out on Sunday afternoon in their boat. They catch fish during the week, and on Sunday they go on a family outing. A frolic and pleasure. The coast of North Carolina became a place for people to go on vacations very early. By the 1840s, people from Elizabeth City and Edenton and so on were going to Nag's Head, and so Nag's Head became a place on the coast. You're familiar with the the painted aristocracy, the wooden houses that are at Nag's Head, they were all built very, very early. But in the period of time that we're talking about, 1903, is when hunting lodges were built all up and down the sandbanks. And interestingly, I've been through the books of a lot of these hunting lodges, and almost all of them were built by the CEOs of companies in New York and Philadelphia. And they would come down, they wanted to hunt, around Thanksgiving, now we have the hunting season, and they would come during the hunting season to shoot ducks. And this is actually a hand-drawn map by a group of people who were men, who were architects in Boston. They were part of the Boston Brahmin class, and they made this map showing their favorite spots where they would like to shoot from, and they kept records of exactly how many ducks they shot, or geese, I guess, from each spot on every day. It was like a diary. Another hunting lodge, but the interesting thing about these hunting lodges is that they were almost always operated by blacks. And they were built, maintained, and operated by blacks. So in this image of the white people who are coming to shoot, there are blacks, the people who actually build, take care of, and serve as guides for the people who are hunting. I have to show this picture of Orville Wright. I've written a good bit about the Wright brothers and their guns. And in 1911, this picture was taken of Orville cleaning their .22 repeating rifle. And fortunately, I found, in addition to that photograph, a group of targets that the Wright brothers used, and these are targets from 1908. And they had a very interesting game. Last year, the National Rifle Association approached me about doing an article about the Wright brothers and their guns, and they were going to do an article, and I said, let me write the article. And so I wrote the article for them, which was published in August or September, I think. But anyways, interesting story. The Wright brothers almost never frolicked, but in 1911, Wilbur was in New York in court trying to defend the Wright brothers' patent, and Orville was in North Carolina with his brother Loren. This is Loren. And this is Horace, who was Lauren's son. The Wright brothers, never married. They also didn't graduate from high school. Anyway, this is the only time you ever see a picture of the Wright brothers frolicking, and it was only because Wilbur was not there. He would never have allowed it. People and prejudice. One of the things I explore in this book is 1903 was a period of time in which white supremacy was emerging. And in these photographs and in the book, I try to explain the unbelievable contradictions about white supremacy and what's going on in these photographs. These were kids, 1908. They were in a house between Manteo and Fort Raleigh. And James Hare just took this picture of these kids standing in the doorway. This picture was taken by Perney Cronk. He was very interested in blacks and how they lived and their schools and so on. And so he took this picture of a black family in their house, and architecturally this house is very, very interesting because almost no pictures were taken of houses like this from this period. But he also went to schools. Now, 1899, 3 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that separate but equal schools were fine, already in 1899, blacks were organizing to have superb, first-rate schools. The teachers were all college graduates. They were black teachers. They graduated from the many North Carolina colleges that were created by churches after the Civil War, and they were the best teachers you could ever imagine. So even though the schools were separated after 1896, the black schools, even though they had very poor funding, the schools were superb because of the great teachers. And I don't know whether, there are several pictures of schools in the book that you can look at. History and mythology. I mentioned that, Fred Olds, who created the North Carolina Museum of History, and fortunately for me, in 1908, he took a trip, which he called, I think he called it a jaunt up and down the eastern North Carolina or something like that. But anyway, I retitled it A Jaunt Around the Carolina Coast in 1908. And Olds, on this trip, he went from Raleigh, he went by train, down to Wellington. He visited Orton Plantation. Then he went up Jacksonville. He went to New Bern. He went through the canal that connected New Bern to Beaufort. And then he went through the inland sea to spots all the way up on the inside. And he described in this jaunt what a great wonder this area was of North Carolina. And he talked about the people, and it's so weird because, there are many odd things about his trip, but one is he talked about all the blacks that were encountered by him and his group as they were going through this long trip. It was a 10 or 12-day trip, or maybe longer, I can't remember. And he talked about the black postman and the black this and the black person who helped here and the black pilot and so on. But when he's heading back to Raleigh, he says, we don't have a problem with blacks on the coast of North Carolina. In fact, we hardly ever encountered a soul, which was so weird because, they couldn't be seen because of his white supremacist point of view. Well, anyway, in 1908, the weirdest thing happened. Fred Olds is going up the coast of North Carolina, and he ends up in Manteo at the Fort Raleigh Monument. You've seen the Fort Raleigh Monument, perhaps, that commemorates the lost colony. It's right behind the Visitor Center at Fort Raleigh. By 1908, the story of the lost colony was becoming a great mystery. It hadn't been a popular mystery before that time, but it started becoming a great mystery, and a lot of people were talking about it. And so whenever out-of-towners came to Manteo, they would all want to go over to Fort Raleigh. So these are two of the reporters who came to cover the Wright brothers' flights. And they were here about May 8th or 9th, something like that. And they stayed at the Tranquil Inn, and they went over. Wilbur and Orville Wright stayed at the Tranquil Inn. But also, by May 20th in 1908, there was an event at this monument in which Virginia Dare was sanctified. That's my term. She was sanctified because on May 20th, 1908, the white supremacists in North Carolina decided to take advantage of the fact that Virginia Dare was the first white person born in the territory of what became the United States. Not the first English person, but the first white person, which fit into the lore. And all of a sudden they started worshiping Sir Walter Raleigh as, you know, the great creator of America. And so anyway, Sally Southall Cotton wrote her book about the white doe, celebrating Virginia Dare right at this time. And the interesting thing to me about 1908, have you ever read any stories about searches for the lost colony? Recently? Yeah? Well, in 1908, everybody knew where the lost colony was. And it was agreed upon. So I don't know what we're doing now, because 1908 they knew. All the historians, even Sally Southall Cotton, everybody knew where the lost colony was. And what happened to the lost colony? Because, Sally Southall Cotton, she was a great popularizer of North Carolina history, a leader of women's groups. She was a fantastic person. I gave a talk at Farmville Public Library a couple of months ago. And in the Farmville Public Library, they said, you know what, we have a letter from Sally Southall Cotton that we'd like to show you. And so it's dated May 20th, 1908, which was the day that Virginia Dare was sanctified. And it's interesting because this letter is from Sally Southall Cotton to Stephen Weeks, who was a great North Carolina historian located at Trinity College, which is now Duke. And Weeks, who was not a stupid historian, he was a good historian, studied the descendants of the lost colony and confirmed that they lived in Robeson County, North Carolina. All historians in North Carolina agreed. The General Assembly of North Carolina agreed. No archaeology was needed. It's really weird. It's really weird, but that they really believed that. And so Fred Olds took a little jaunt right down to Robeson County. And at that time, they were called Croatan Indians because the colony moved to Croatan. And Fred Olds said, well, this is the way they live today in these interesting log cabins. This is a school that he visited at Pates. This became the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, as they call it. And Fred Olds gave a talk to the students at this school. This was the Croatan Normal School at Pates in 1908. And he said, according to Olds, the students bore tints ranging from the deep copper color of the Indian to almost a perfect white. And the theory was that the whites were the descendants of the people from the lost colony. But it's just amazing. You can check any of the great historians in the period of time, and they all agreed. Well, anyway, I stand by that monument sometimes. It's like, what is going on down here in the coast of North Carolina? And I just contemplate, well, I don't know. I'll just keep on contemplating it for a long, long time. But anyway, that's my contemplation. So just to summarize very quickly, the arguments I'm making in this book is that the Wright brothers are dead wrong about nobody knowing where Kitty Hawk was. Everybody knew. the terms Outer Banks and Graveyard of the Atlantic had not been invented in 1903. The North Carolina coast had a superb world-class infrastructure, which made it linked to the world completely. And the Wright brothers they loved finding how well it was connected, and they used it through all of their experiments. The North Carolina coast was immediately accessible to every city on the east coast of the United States, and almost immediate, almost as quick as Prime. Maybe not quite as quick as Prime, but almost as quick as Prime. The North Carolina Sounds had become an inland sea connected with Norfolk on the north, Beaufort on the south. The train system was extremely efficient. The trains actually went everywhere, not just Amtrak routes up and down the coast, but they went everywhere. You could go anywhere on a train. White supremacy had taken hold completely in North Carolina. And at that event on May 20th in 1908, Francis Winston, who was the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina, who made more speeches at the dedication of Confederate soldier monuments than anybody in North Carolina, announced that North Carolina had solved its racial problem because the Indians had been banished and the Negroes, as they called them at that time, were under complete control. And so we could go on building our white civilization as Sir Walter Raleigh had always intended it would be. And lastly, that at least at that time, they thought the lost colony had been found. That's it. I will try to answer some questions. I saw your hand go up first.
You say most of the authorities agreed in 1908 that the descendants of the lost colony were in Robeson County.
Yes.
How did Lumbee feel about that? Did they agree?
How did the Lumbee feel?
Dr. Tise, can you repeat the question?
Oh, okay. The question was, how did the Lumbee feel about the lost colony being found in Robeson County? Well, see, that's one of the complications because North Carolina, at the same time it was suppressing blacks and Indians, once the theory was developed that the Indians in Robeson County were descendants of the lost colony, or they thought they had discovered it, they were called Croatan Indians. They took on the name Croatan. And so, fallaciously, what are now called the Lumbee Indians were at that time called the Croatan Indians. And so they were the beneficiaries because the state of North Carolina recognized the Croatan, which are now the Lumbee, as being containing the descendants of the lost colony.
So they
But
had no reason to disagree with it.
No, because they didn't want to go, the Lumbee then did not want to go to school with blacks. And they wanted their own schools. And they were arguing that they had a cohesive Indian community, which they argue today too. And so they wanted their own schools. And so they went to the North Carolina General Assembly, and the North Carolina General Assembly said, "You're descendants of the lost colony. So therefore, we will give you a special status." So that's how Pembroke come about. It's a school system in Robeson County, but it also extended to Sampson County, just for Croatan Indians because they are the descendants of the lost colony. It's weird thinking. It's a very complicated story. There's another hand back here. Yes, sir.
We can wait for the microphones or online.
All righty.
Oh, can you say anything about the railroad that was built just north of that was built to take lumber from that area across
To the landing.
across the sound.
Wow, I didn't know about that. However, it was very common for timber companies then and now to build temporary railways. And if you go around mining operations, temporary railways. In fact, the North Carolina State Capitol, when it was built in 1835 or something like that, they built a railroad to haul the granite from the granite source to where the state capitol is. When Duke University was built, they built a railroad to take the stone, there in the 1920s. I lived down the street from Girard College, which was built in 1831. They built a railroad to bring in the stone for that. So yeah, temporary railroads were frequently built. But I don't know about that one.
Well, this is a short railroad, only about
Yeah.
a mile long.
Yeah.
It went from what's called the Buxton Woods
Yeah,
to the sound.
I'm not surprised, but I hadn't heard of that. Yeah.
If there are other questions, we can take a few more.
In your presentation, you mentioned the brother, the photographer, Lauren, and I know there's a sister, a Wright sister, who was
Catherine,
very,
yeah.
very much involved. Basically, she took care of Wilbur and Orville because they never married. So that was the closest thing they had to a wife, was the sister.
Right.
But you didn't mention that.
No, I didn't mention that because I focused basically on people who were here. Catherine never went to the coast of North Carolina, or else I would have mentioned her. But Catherine was the only Wright member of the Wright family who graduated from college. Wilbur and Orville did not graduate from high school, and she went to Oberlin, and she was a trustee at Oberlin. The Wright brothers. Wilbur was a dreamer. Orville was a hands-on person. He was an engineer and a hands-on person. They needed somebody to make order out of their existence, and Catherine did that. And she doesn't get the credit that she should. The sad thing about it, though, and nobody's really written this the way it needs to be written, but after Wilbur died, Orville became a sad sack. He grieved for 36 years after Wilbur died. And so he and Catherine basically became a couple. And they traveled to Europe, they traveled all over the place, they went everywhere together. And one day in 1926, when Orville was shipping his airplane over to England to be exhibited at the National Science Museum, Catherine, I've read all of Catherine's letters about this, but she decided she wanted to get married to somebody else, not Orville. and so anyway, in her letters, she writes to her husband-to-be, I can't tell Orville now because he's fighting with the Smithsonian and he depends on me so much to support him. I'll tell him next week. And then there's another letter. I couldn't tell him. Orville was a sad sack. And so finally she just announced, I'm getting married, Orville. And he said, no, you're not. And she said, oh, yes, I am. And he said, well, I'm not going to the wedding. And she said, well, you don't have to go to the wedding. And so she got married at Oberlin College, not in Dayton. And she moved to Kansas City with her husband. And Orville said, I will never see you again as long as I live. And so she died, unfortunately, 3 years later. I can't remember whether she had a brain tumor or something. And Lauren, the brother Lauren, went and got Orville and said, Orville, you are going to see Catherine. And so he took Orville to Kansas City, and he got there right before she died. But she was a crucial member. She was She was the umpire, she was zany. She taught Greek and Latin in high school.
Next, we have a question from our online audience, and they ask, has your forward-looking view of the Outer Banks changed after conducting historical research for circa 1903?
My forward-looking,
That's what it says.
you mean from now or forward from 1903? There's a lot happened after 1903. I'm not sure I understand, but I guess I would, I guess the questioner is asking about from now on, and I share the views of the people who understand the geology and the environment that we got to get with it and understand, what nature is trying to do to the coast of North Carolina, and I don't see how we can sustain all of the construction that has occurred. We need to stop building bridges and start using ducks. You familiar with ducks? Yeah. If you go to Philadelphia, there are ducks all over the city. Taking people around. They're Second World War vehicles that can go through water or, yeah. That's my solution.
And we have time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
So why this picture for the front?
You know what? I can't answer that except that I proposed a picture for the front, and I can't remember what it was now. And so it's published by the University of North Carolina Press, and they have designers with designing ideas, and so they sent me an email one day, and they said, "Well, we finished the cover of the book. Hope you like it." And I looked at it and I thought, I never would have thought of that picture as a cover of this book, but I like it. I like it. I mean, I thought it was really good because it shows the spirit of the Wright brothers, just taking some time off. Like I said, Orville would never have allowed it to happen. Wilbur would not have allowed it to happen. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank y'all for being such a wonderful audience, and thanks to the Coastal Studies Institute. And I hope you will go forward and spread all of my radical ideas and straighten out people that it's not the Outer Banks, this is the sandbanks. This is the Barrier Islands. Get it straight, you guys. And the graveyard of the Atlantic, what's that all about? Anyway, thank you very much.